Okay, hello and welcome everyone. So in this video, we are talking about assessing opportunities in a market. This is the second lecture in the Economics of Entrepreneurship course. And the idea is, well, here we have gotten some product or market that we think might be profitable. And the question is that really the case, or is it likely to be the situation where other factors in the market are going to whittle away our profits? So firstly, we'll define a market. Think about what we mean by market. We'll think about assessing opportunity in that market through the value-added and Porter's 5 forces analysis. Then I'll illustrate with examples of Zipcar and seat-side service. So value-added is thinking about what profitability there is in the market as a whole. And Porter's 5 forces is thinking about how much of this are we going to be able to capture. All right, so by market we mean a place. Some place where products or service are priced. And place is abstract. So this could be virtual, it could be a physical location, or whatever. The basic idea is we're interested in something where the good or service is priced, right? So we're having some market-determined prices. We're thinking about buyers and sellers coming together for this transaction mediated by prices. In order to define our market, we need the product itself. We need substitutes because those are going to influence both buyers and sellers. We need the buyers of the products, both the actual and potential buyers who might be induced to purchase or might be convinced to leave, and sellers of the market, similarly, who are actually producing the product currently or who might be induced to produce it in the future. A lot of examples about markets. Markets are everywhere, but you could think about the contrast between, like, for instance, retail gasoline and diamonds, right? Think about a situation where you have a lot of sellers of a largely homogeneous product in the case of gasoline. You think of like the diamonds, think about the diamonds market, because there's kind of a big difference between wholesale and then at jewelry stores, but there's certainly markets. Think about the soft drink market, where there's quite a bit of variation, quite a bit of product differentiation. Prescription drugs, where there's differentiation, but then there's market power within each individual niche. And then think of something like, well, graduating Michigan BAs in econ. So University of Michigan holds a monopoly over the ability to be able to grant that particular degree. However, many other universities grant econ degrees as well. And so in the market as a whole, U of M is not a monopoly. Anyway, so those are examples of markets. We can think about the substitutes. You think about the complements. You could think about who the buyers and sellers are for each of those examples. Anyway. For the value-added analysis, what we're interested in doing is we're interested in determining the profitable potential for that particular product. So we want to think about what's going to be the value created for buyers, what's going to be the value that the firm could maximally extract. The value-added analysis involves two things. It involves the supply curve and involves the demand curve, right? Value-added is going to be our difference between demand and supply, right? By supply, we're representing cost, especially for our monopoly. Monopoly won't have a supply curve, but the monopoly will have a cost curve. Value added represents the maximal profits you could possibly extract. And so the idea is we want to think of, is there a lot of value created by this product? Meaning, are buyers willing to pay a lot for it? And is it going to be something we can produce profitably? So you actually kind of need both of those. You need high demand and you need low cost, because it's not the type, there's a lot of different products. There's a lot of different things you could think about where consumers would have a use for it. We must also speak for the cost associated with bringing that to the market, right? I would definitely like, every time I walk into a classroom, for there to be individual refrigerators so we could each take our lunch or take our soda and have it nice and cool with it right there on the desk. Maybe there's a substantial interest and substantial demand for it. The cost of doing that is exorbitant. And so this is something relevant for the pre-business plan project for later in the course, where when you're doing the value-added analysis, and even for problem set and for the exam, if you're doing the value-added analysis, you need to convince us that not only is the demand high, and that's obvious, everybody's going to think of value-added by thinking about, like, what's the value created for buyers, but also that the costs are low, right? And that there's value that's here to be extracted. All right, so here's the graph of it. Value added, it looks just like what we've previously defined as economic surplus, consumer surplus, the difference between demand and costs. And this is thinking about the total potential economic value that could be extracted from the market. how would the firm get all of this? Well, through either first-degree price discrimination or two-part tariff, and we'll discuss that later on. But value added is the difference between the demand curve, or between demand and then between the cost associated with the particular product. Now, once we've identified a situation where we have significant value added for a product, there's a second question, which is, yeah, there's economic value to be created, but are we going to be able to capture it as profits? And that's an important question to answer, because there might be competitors, might be substitute products, might be entrants, might be suppliers, might be demanders that are going to drive our profits to zero. So the question is, not only is there a lot of value added, but are we able to capture a large slice of it? For this, we'll introduce Porter's 5 forces. So the 5 forces are rivalry amongst existing firms, potential entrants, buyer bargaining power, substitutes, and then supplier bargaining power. And I'll go over each in turn. For rivalry amongst existing firms, we're thinking about those who are present in the market. Typically, if you're entering, we're thinking about what's the competitive balance already. If you're in the market, you're thinking about potential entrants. If you're a potential entrant yourself, you're thinking, are there going to be future potential entrants? For buyer bargaining power, you're thinking about who your buyers are and do they have a lot of influence over the price? Supplier bargaining power, you're thinking about who the suppliers are and do they have a large, are you beholden to individual or to many suppliers? And then for substitutes, we're thinking about like what substitutes are there for the product, for the industry as a whole. We're not thinking about this in the sense of rivalry, but we're like thinking about substitutes. Think about, suppose we're doing a Porter's 5 forces for the airline industry. Our rivalry amongst existing firms is where we'd market or where we'd mention Southwest, American, JetBlue, and so on and so forth. For substitutes is where we mention things like Zoom and video conferencing. So substitutes for the industry as a whole. All right, so I'll go over the first one, rivalry among existing competitors. Clearly, more rivalry means that there's going to be downward pressure on prices. That's going to mean less profits, right? So the lower the prices are, the lower the profits are, and that's bad. In order to do this, we want to think about how many competitors there are. And is there product differentiation? So how close are those competitors, right? Are there many competitors? Are there few competitors? Are they close competitors or are they distant competitors? So think about product differentiation. Here would be like an application of the cross-price elasticity of demand to determine the sensitivity between consumers responding to changes in rival prices. Are there capacity constraints? So Bertrand oligopoly versus Cournot oligopoly. Bertrand is price-setting oligopoly. Cournot is quantity-setting oligopoly. Are capacity constraints important? Meaning, could a single firm serve everyone in the market or not? Right? And so that's relevant for rivalry. If a single firm could not serve the entire market, that changes the rivalry than if one actually could. Consumer switching cost, is it costly for consumers to go from one provider to another, or is it pretty low cost? So like think about it at the grocery store, buying different types of paper towels, switching costs are pretty low. Although you could think of like the switching costs, or an industry where switching costs are high, like different cell phone plans, right? So you actually have to call up and you'd have to go through customer service, and it's kind of an arduous process. The telecom example is one where there's switching costs, high switching costs. The paper towel example is one where there's low switching costs. Consumer search costs, is it easy for consumers to find alternatives or is it hard? Are there high exit barriers? So are there specific assets that are going to keep firms in the market and possibly keeping firms in the market long after they should, right? So for competitive market, we're thinking about, for competition, we're thinking about, is it easy access and easy exit? Meaning like, can any firm come in? And so then you have to worry about firms coming in, or you have to worry about entry. And then what about exit? And if there's free entry and free exit, then you've got something that's more competitive. If it's more difficult to get out of the industry, now you've got a situation where there will be further from competition. Is there the possibility of tacit collusion? And in particular, you want to think about, are you possibly entering an industry that's already characterized by tacit collusion? In which case, if you notice that the rivals are setting high prices relative to your costs, you might think you can enter in and undercut everybody substantially when maybe they're having their prices artificially high and maybe their costs are low too. So we want to be able to recognize tacit collusion. Substitute products. So how close are the substitutes? So this would be relevant thinking about the cross-price elasticity. So are they near substitutes? Are they far substitutes in the minds of consumers? And then what's the nature of competition in the substitute markets? So thinking about substitute products. So thinking about the relative willingness of consumers to use airlines for business meetings and travel versus using Zoom. And thinking about, are those close substitutes or not? Maybe during a pandemic, they're pretty close substitutes. Maybe not. Maybe Zoom is preferred to air travel. Thinking about the structure of competition in the substitute market. So what's the level of competition amongst video conferencing providers would be the analysis that airline that you do from the perspective of airlines if you're doing a five forces analysis. Market power of buyers. I mean, definitely more market power means less profits for the firm in general. The idea is like here you have a situation where buyers can bargain away by competing down the prices, some of the profits that you'd have. So buyers are more powerful when they're concentrated. Think of like monopsony. Monopsony means a single buyer. It's like a monopoly, but it's for buyers. Or do you have only a few big buyers? Are they buying in large volumes? Can they easily switch to another supplier? These are all things that are going to give buyers more power. And to the extent that that's the case in this industry, you'd want to be careful because this is something that will tend towards lower prices, which means, yes, there might be a lot of value added. There might be a big gap between the demand curve and the cost curve, but how close to that demand curve can you get with your pricing? If buyers have a lot of market power, then maybe not as close as you'd like. So some examples of buyer power, you could think of Whole Foods buying some new high-end grocery product. So think of like, there's an example of, I'm forgetting the name, there's an example of a ice cream alternative. I think it's Wink frozen treats that had been on Shark Tank. And so they're in Whole Foods now. And so so Whole Foods would be a major buyer for them. Thinking about like where you're going to sell this product, where the outlets are. You could sell direct to consumers via your website, and then the buyers would have small buyer power, or you could sell to the Whole Foods or a wholesaler or something like that. And now all of a sudden, or a grocery store, now all of a sudden they're buying larger volumes and they have more buying power. Thinking about General Motors buying parts from suppliers, right? Maybe these suppliers are making parts that can only be used in General Motors vehicles. If that's the case, this gives the suppliers less power because GM is like they're kind of beholden to a single buyer. All right, so think about market power of your input suppliers. It's the same idea here. The basic idea is, how many potential suppliers are there? Are there close substitute inputs? So could you use a different input entirely, or could you use a different supplier? How costly is it for you to switch suppliers? Is it pretty easy? Or have you made relationship-specific investments? Meaning, like maybe these plants that are producing parts for General Motors have made a capital configuration that's useful for producing GM products, but bad for producing Ford products. That would make it very costly for them to, for the plant to produce for somebody else. The same logic here. How costly is it for you to switch suppliers? Maybe GM paid for the supplier's build out, and now they'd have to make that same investment if they went to a different factory or a different input supplier. Is there potential for backward integration? So Amazon's trying to do this. Think about like the major costs in online retailing comes down to a lot of shipping costs. And so Amazon's interesting because they don't make profits on their product end. They're essentially a data company, but their major cost that they face in distributing profits or distributing products is the shipping. Shipping is extremely expensive, and they're pretty much stuck with UPS, FedEx, and the Postal Service. So what's Amazon working towards doing? They're working towards backward integration. They're working towards making their own suppliers of package delivery services. And now we see Amazon trucks going around, and maybe in the future Amazon drones. And this is important because Amazon, otherwise UPS, FedEx, Post Office would have had quite a bit of bargaining power over Amazon. So this is a way to kind of limit the amount of market power of suppliers. Are you a major customer or a minor one? Are you a monopsony buyer, or are there many other buyers? So how important is it for for that particular supplier to sell to you at a low price. And these are things that will affect the market power of suppliers, and therefore your cost side and how much profits are going to be whittled away on the cost end. And then potential entrants. So the more difficult it is to enter an industry, the better it is for you as an existing competitor. You could think about barriers to entry, and you could think about the role of barriers to entry being strategic. So I've got some examples here, but you can think of, like, suppose you're a local bed and breakfast and Airbnb is coming in. Is there a barrier to entry? Well, maybe there's a regulatory barrier to entry. You could petition city council not to allow Airbnb to operate, because that'd be an important entrant that you'd want to try to block through regulation. And you try to make the regulation such that it's easy for you to comply with, but difficult for Airbnb to comply with. So the interesting thing is that there are possibly situations where the incumbents can try to build their own entry barriers. But other things, like there's governmental protection in the case of like patents and copyright for intellectual property rights, although these have expiration dates. There's government policy, which should typically be like our regulated industries like power, gas, water. That's not typically probably what our entrepreneurs are going to be getting into, at least as the primary provider. However, you could think of the regulation example I gave with like the bed and breakfast trying to regulate Airbnb. There could be cost disadvantages to entrants in the case of if there's large economies of scale, learning by doing, or distribution channels. So economies of scale means as you increase your output, this reduces the costs. So if you're producing a large volume, this lowers the cost. Well, that can be an entry barrier because you're not going to go from zero to a massive scale, right? And so if you've got a firm who's already producing and has achieved economies of scale, they could have a cost advantage over a smaller potential entrant. Learning by doing means typically means in terms of human capital, but learning how to operate, learning how to efficiently produce, learning different production techniques by virtue of having operated in the industry. And so some of this production knowledge can be really important for lowering costs, just knowing how to do the job better. And then distribution channels, like already having your network in place and stuff like this, can be really important in terms of, if you're already operating in an industry that eliminates one of the barriers that an entrant would have to face, which is like coming up with a way to get their product to consumers and finding their market. So that in itself can be a barrier. Suppose there's large entry costs that existing firms have already incurred. So these could be like large sunk costs. I'll think about this when we think about entry deterrence, about the role that large sunk costs could have in deterring entrant. So you could think of this as suppose you've made some capital expansion or some quality innovation that any potential rival would have to match to be able to have a legitimate shot at threatening for market share. Maybe there's consumer or supplier switching costs. Maybe there's something like brand loyalty that can make it difficult for entrants to come in. And maybe there's some possibility of some entry deterring behavior. And then the comment that I'll make there is you have to be careful with entry deterrent behavior that what you're doing isn't illegal, because all of a sudden now you could run afoul of antitrust officials, and the dealing with the U.S. Justice Department is going to be in many cases worse than dealing with a potential entrant, although that kind of depends on a case-by-case basis. All right, so now I want to go over some examples applying these ideas. So the first is Zipcar. So Zipcar offers hourly rentals of autos in urban areas. They've got cars parked conveniently so that people without cars can use the app and then enter the car and then drive the car. The member who signed up gets a key card, some electronic ID, maybe via the app. There's door ignition locks connected to this device. After the reservation is made, the car automatically opens, key card is swiped in front, the key's inside, and the car and you can drive off with the car. So it's really easy for consumers, low cost to run. In terms of at the marginal, on the marginal side, this is something can be reserved online space. Pricing is going to vary by city. So for Ann Arbor's occasional driver plan, this is a couple of years ago, but the same basic idea holds. There's a sign-up fee of $25. There's an annual fee of $70 or a $7 monthly fee for new customers. Then $5.50 and up per hour, $55 and up per day, up to 200 miles, including gas and insurance. You think about how the pricing works. They have expanded across the country, city by city, over the past several years, a couple decades. Now they have several hundred locations. There had been a merger with an important competitor that had entered typically different markets. And the basic idea is like they want to locate by college campuses, they want to locate by business centers, stuff like that. So the value-added analysis. Well, on the demand side, we want to think about what it is that consumers are willing to pay. So think about who your buyers are. Think about why they don't have a car in the first place. Think about the alternatives to owning a car. Think about public transportation, taxi, conventional rental car companies. Think about Uber, Lyft, so on and so forth. And the demand side. So think about how this affects the demand curve for these particular cars or for these short-term rental cars. On the cost side, capital utilization is an issue. How much each car is going to ultimately get used. So you need to have enough demand in a small area. Otherwise, you're incurring this large fixed cost of having this parking lot. Of having a parking lot in probably a desirable area where real estate's really expensive, and then accruing different types of fees and whatnot to the provider. So the idea is like you want to have enough cars in good locations, but that's going to be expensive, and so you want lower average fixed costs. So you want a large volume, which is going to require a large amount of demand in a small area. So what would you do? Well, probably some market research, some surveys to get answers to important questions about possible usage. And I'll talk about this in terms of market research and surveys for estimating demand for a product, and that'll be the next lecture. In terms of the 5 forces analysis before entry, so think about the existing competitors, none to speak of in most cities from the standpoint of like industry rivalry. There were 2 small firms in Portland and Seattle. Think about the market power of suppliers. Well, the suppliers would be the automobile manufacturers, insurance companies, parking lots, technology. It doesn't seem like the suppliers would have quite a bit of market power. There's a lot of different alternatives, and you're not locked into any individual, especially if you're geographically flexible here. Market power of buyers, that's not an issue. Buyers are going to be small relative. They're going to be small buyers, not large volume. The substitutes, well, thinking about outside the industry, there's traditional car rentals, there's taxis, there's public transport, there's Uber and Lyft. Potential entrants, so we're doing this prior to entry. So potential entrants would be Uber and Lyft and ride sharing. Traditional car rental companies could be an entrant. Ordinary car companies, indeed, like GM with Maven entering into Ann Arbor, and other car companies have had different types of similar to Zipcar programs. Geographic expansion by the other 2 companies if they rose, or other imitators. And so these are different types of threats from entrants. Regarding value added, well, thinking about our strategy here, well, first what you'd want to do is do a feasibility study using consumer surveys and see, do you have a large amount of demand in the area that you're focusing on? What they did was they started in Boston. So this was probably the market most amenable to service due to the geography and the demographics. So people not with a lot of car ownership, but people who might want cars for a short term. And so this is kind of a good place to pilot and test out their viability. On the other hand, real estate costs a little bit more in Boston than some other areas. But anyway, you'd want to do quite a bit of pre-entry, post-entry quantitative analysis. So you estimate your demand and then estimate the responsiveness of consumers and kind of do a lot of data analysis to figure out what are going to be the best locations for locating your cars, and then that's where going to be. Let's see. And then in terms of developing the key competitive advantages, well, think about optimal location. So think about putting these cars in a place that's going to be convenient relative to people's other alternatives, making it more convenient than rentals, more convenient than public transportation, keeping cost low, hopefully, relative to like Uber, hopefully more appealing cars than standard rental, so hopefully high quality. When I was at University of Arizona, the Zipcar nearby, I believe, had like a new Toyota Prius, which back then probably a lot of people might have been interested in driving just for the fact that it had been kind of a new innovation. Dealing with entry, so think about partnerships with universities. If you want to market to university students and you have a partnership with the university, now it could be really difficult for a rival to come in, and especially to get a good location. They did have a merger with Flexcar. So the partnerships were like University of Arizona. I think they had a merger. I think they had a partnership with Pitt when I was there. The location was kind of like halfway between Pitt and Carnegie Mellon, which are neighbors. And then they use this two-part pricing strategy. So you have this membership fee, but then you have this per unit fee. We'll call this a two-part tariff, and I'll show you how two-part tariffs work in later lectures, or you could search my videos that I've got up already. All right, the other example is seat-side service. So seat-side service was offering in-seat delivery of concessions at entertainment venues. So for instance, at a sporting event or at a concert, and the idea is like you've got this app to be able to order. You give them your seat number, your billing information, they bring your concessions. So there's some write-ups of this. There's two, I don't know if they were University of Michigan students at the time or if they had recently graduated. I forgot. I could go back and kind of read the article. But the problem was one of the fellows was at a game, I believe at Comerica Park, and was like, wait a second, there should be an app to be able to have my food delivered. And when they opened up the app, it didn't have anything like that. It maybe had like the game calendar and like you buy tickets or something like that. And it seemed like this is something that should exist and didn't at the time. So here you go. And the basic idea is, well, so 3 years ago, now this is probably like 8 years ago now. So they tested this out at the Toledo Mud Hens, which is a AAA minor league game, at concerts at Freedom Hill Amphitheater. The idea is to integrate with existing concessions. So there's a partnership with the venue. And the idea is think about what's going on here. They already have the concession stands. They have the consumers. The consumers are hungry. They want concessions. The concession stand want consumers. But people don't want to get up and miss the game. It's a pain to kind of walk in front of people. So there's this allocation problem. There's these high transaction costs. A lot of entrepreneurship, a lot of modern entrepreneurship deals with lowering transaction costs. That's what seat-side service does. The idea is you can make this seamless matching between the hungry customers and the concession stands with the concessions available. And the idea is then somebody runs down to the consumer, and the idea is the concession stand, the venue, bears that transaction cost rather than the consumer, because the consumer is there to watch the game, which is the important complement to the concessions that they're interested in. The revenue came from this convenient fee, something of like 10 to 15% on orders, and ended up being results were really favorable. So in terms of the value-added analysis, there's existing demand and supply for concessions. It's a matching problem. What seat-side service does is this has this incremental value added. The idea is that it's able to reduce and alleviate these high transaction costs. And like I said, apparently the data from Toledo is very supportive of incremental value added. They talk about I think something like revenues had gone up by like 40%. You look back at the article, and this is all kind of like based on the article, but you could imagine how just eliminating this sort of like high transaction cost associated with going up, missing the game, or whatever, leads to higher concession revenue, which is really important for these venues. In terms of the five forces analysis, what's the competition amongst existing competitors and substitutes? Well, there is no existing direct competitors, and that's something that can be limited by virtue of the contract or the partnership you'd have with the venue. The substitutes, so thinking about substitutes kind of outside the industry, were people walking around delivering concessions, but that's a different substitute, because then they're limited to what those people are currently carrying in anticipation of finding buyers. I remember I was at Chase Field in Arizona watching a Diamondbacks game, and somebody was walking around, or a vendor was walking around with these really large cookies, and I wanted a large cookie. It's bigger than my head. It's like, I want one of these huge cookies that I could see from the upper deck and the cheap seats that I could afford as a grad student. And I was like, I got to get down to the seats where they're selling these things. And I spent 2 or 3 innings trying to find the person that was selling the large cookies. I couldn't find these at the concession stand. And so these are not super good substitutes for whatever the service would be. Indeed, walk-up purchases, the hawkers are substantially different. Here because the limitation to what they're currently carrying. Here because you're missing the game and you're incurring that large transaction cost. What about market power of demanders and suppliers? The plausibility for rivals to come in? Well, the key is working with the venue and then the current concession providers. This is important. The current concession providers are supplying a lot of the demand by choosing products that consumers want, and they're the ones that are beholden to this input to supplier powers. How many vendors are there for hot dogs, for instance, or for popcorn or soda or whatever? And then however, like once you've got the relationship with a particular venue, now you've got a single supplier, namely their concession stands. And so we'd be really interested in the structures of these markets for assessing for doing the complete five forces analysis for seat side service. All right, and then this ultimately this is my end. So as I'm ending, a couple things. So I'll talk about this, then I'll show one more thing. So the next topic is thinking about optimal pricing, then thinking about determining the demand curve for the product. You could do this through market experimentation and consumer surveys, and I'll talk about how that works. This is not second to last thing I want to show. Puppy study break. So this is my puppy study break. That's Ani. And here is I've put this on Canvas. So here is the table that I would encourage us to use for the five forces analysis. This is a good way to kind of organize it. So we got rivalry amongst existing firms, substitute products, market power of your buyers, market power of input suppliers, potential entrants, and then you put a check mark, high, medium, low, whichever, and then you put your notes to justify. So the idea is for a particular example or for an exam question or something, what you do is you'd give me your justification. You'd say, is rivalry high? So look at seat side service, actually looking at Zipcar as well. Rivalry would be low. There's nobody there. Substitute products, I don't know, maybe there's a medium, because in the case of both, there's things that people are already doing seemingly well. Market power of buyers, really low for Zipcar. Pretty low for seat side service if you're thinking about individual ticket holders. Market power of input suppliers, pretty low to medium for Zipcar. Pretty well for seat side service. Your market power of your input supplier very well might be the venue and their concessions, and then they might actually have quite a bit of power. Potential entrants, well, probably medium to low depending on your partnerships in Zipcar with universities or business or industrial parks, business centers, and then probably low once you've got this contract in the case of seat side service. And then you'd have your notes, you kind of basically saying what I was talking about just now. Anyway, hope you enjoyed. I'll see you next time.